So today we have with us very distinguished economist, Professor Arun Kumar, who is not a stranger to people who watch television. He's not only an economist, he also intervenes in public debate. So he sort of explains complex ideas in economics to the lay reader, to the lay person who may be watching television. So he's probably the right person to tell us what is going on. It's basically an explainer on this fear that the world is on the brink of a recession, because many have recalled the fact that last time inflation was high and food inflation was high. We had a lot of trouble. We had Arab Spring. So there was a lot of churning. So the US economy went down, although that was ostensibly for another reason. So this time too, there's inflation. Globally, inflation is high. So many are fearing, many are saying we could see a global recession. But as Professor Arun Kumar was saying, he was tying this to the war, the war in Ukraine and the sanctions. So he was saying that let's see how that goes. So we can start with that. So how is the war so important to this fear or this question that is there in many people's minds?
So thank you for having me, greetings to all the guests that you have on the channel who are viewing your program. You see, the war that's taking place is actually a proxy war between two big blocs. You have Russia, a superpower on the one hand, and Ukraine, a small country backed by NATO and USA on the other hand. So while Russia is attacking Ukraine, there's an attack on Russia by the Western powers through sanctions, and also they're attempting to embroil Russia in this conflict for the long run so that the Russian strength goes down. And NATO is expanding beyond what it was in 1991, 92, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that is posing a challenge to Russian power. On the other hand, also you have China, which has been facing problems vis-a-vis the US and the Western powers. You have the Quad and so on coming up. So China fears that it's being encircled. Mr. Trump has raised tariffs on Chinese products, etc. Had asked US companies to bring their capital back and set up production within USA. So in other words, there are two blocks that are in contention. One is the Western bloc of the rich nations, and the other is Russia, China on the other hand. This is now going to emerge into a new Cold War. That earlier Cold War was between two ideological blocs. Soviet was the socialist bloc and the Western was the capitalist bloc. This time, it's actually two capitalist blocs. Russia and China are also now capitalist countries. They're also looking for hegemony globally, just like the West has been doing hegemony globally. So with the emergence of these two blocks, what's going to happen is that there'll be two separate blocks of trade, two separate blocks of technology, two separate blocks of finance. Because what the US has done is impose financial sanctions on the Russians, and it's saying that if anybody trades with them, then they'll also impose financial sanctions on them. They'll also impose other sanctions, as they have done with Russia. And because China's interest is to go with Russia, China's trade will continue, financial dealings will continue with Russia. So China is also likely to be sanctioned, or at least its trade with the rest of the world will also get sanctioned by the Western powers. India is also likely to continue to trade, and there's worry that, how would the financial payments, etc. be? So in other words, you can see that there are big financial difficulties coming, trade difficulties coming in the global situation. Now, Russia is a big supplier of some critical materials, like, for instance, food items, like wheat. Ukraine is a big supplier of wheat and sunflower oil. Then you have fertilizer coming from there, then some critical metals like nickel and palladium coming from Russia. You have neon gas coming from there, large amounts, which is used for making electronic chips, which we all use in our mobile phones and cars, etc., etc. So in a word, what's happened is that energy supplies, which are the first to be blocked, world supplies come from Russia. So that is having a big impact on prices. The metal prices have gone up, the food prices have gone up, fertilizer prices have gone up. And this is not going to ease anytime soon, because this war is likely to persist. And as you see, both sides will toughen their stand, because Russia would expect to win. Not being able to win, it's now cutting off supplies of gas to Europe, etc. Wherever they're supplying arms, it's also preventing wheat from coming out to the Black Sea. So wheat prices have risen, etc. So in other words, this is going to actually mount further, because now Ukraine has been given membership of the EU. So Russia fears that they'll get more and more support, more and more financial support. The US has already given more than $40 billion of support. So not only armament, but other support, etc. So this situation of conflict is going to only increase over time. If it increases over time, then all these difficulties that we have in the world of finance, in the world of trade, in the world of technology, they will increase. And as they increase, prices will go up. Already there are protests in Britain that prices are going up. There are prices going up in the US for 40 years high inflation rate. Inflation in India, which was already very high before the war started, for now 12, 13 months, the wholesale price index has been going at above 10%, and then you had the situation where the consumer price index has been going up at above 6%. The RBI's tolerance limit for now more than 4 months. And added to all this is the problem in China, the severe lockdown that they implement when there is a wave that comes in. And as a result, China, which is the manufacturing hub of the world, supplies from there have got reduced. So that is creating a further problem with supply bottlenecks. So in addition to the war, the Chinese situation also creates this. So therefore, supply bottlenecks that were already there pre the war have only increased. And with that, shipping has become a problem, because a lot of containers have got blocked. So there's a container shortage and shipping charges have gone up. All this is feeding into inflation in India. It's feeding into inflation all over the world. And when that happens, then the purchasing power of the people, the common people, that goes down, because their incomes don't rise so suddenly. And because of the pandemic in India, especially, there's a lot of unemployment, a lot of wage cuts. So therefore, there's a double whammy for the unorganized sector in India, where there was a lot of wage cuts, there was a lot of retrenchment, etc. And therefore, the unorganized sector, which employs 94% of the workforce in India, they are suffering, and their demand is not increasing. Rather, in fact, it would be decreasing as inflation takes place. Also, for the middle classes, what happened was that during the Delta wave and the others, they exhausted all their savings because of the health costs. There's a lot of black marketing, of oxygen, of medicines, getting hospital beds, etc. So many middle class people also lost all their savings. So even discretionary demand will be a problem. So the consumer sentiment in India has not recovered back to where it was. So in 2020 January, according to RBI, it was at 105. It's still down to about 72, 73. So still a long way to go. So if the consumer sentiment doesn't revive very easily, then what will happen is the demand will remain low. If the demand remains low, then investment will suffer. And if investment suffers, then growth will suffer. So all this situation is pointing to a global crisis and a crisis in the Indian economy, which will result in slowing down of growth. Now, whether it will result in a recession, which means 2 quarters of negative growth, one after the other, right? USA already had 1 quarter of negative growth. Now, whether that will continue, whether the war effort will actually mean further problems in the US and the European economies and all, we cannot predict very well, because it's a very uncertain situation. But it looks very likely that this negative growth that was there in the US, which is likely in the US, that could next continue, and 2 circles of trade develop.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for pointing out that what's happening in Ukraine is actually a proxy war, that there are much larger issues involved. there's a battle between what we used to see, the Soviet Union versus the Western Bloc, and that is kind of getting repeated. So what are India's options? I mean, we used to do something called non-aligned. We used to try to play both sides. And so what can we do now? We are buying coal, we are buying basic
petroleum goods and so on.
Petroleum. And there's already some debate whether that's good in the long term. Are we really buying into Russia's efforts to displace the Western financial system, the dollar trade? They've come up with some kind of alternative. So where are we placed? Are we playing it right? And what else should we do?
So, India is in a very tough situation because we've had defense agreements with the Russians. They supply still 60% of our armament and so on. And we need spare parts, etc., for very critical things like BrahMos missiles, for Sukhoi aircraft and so on, which we are making, but under license from them. And they supply some of the critical parts. Similarly, AK-47, and now this new plant in UP, which is producing the rifles. So all those equipment, will require Russian support. We also have the nuclear submarine from them. We have other things, from them. So these are very critical things that India requires, especially given China at the border. China is a much more powerful country, and we need all the help. And recently, in the last 15 years, we're getting more and more equipment from the US. We have got Rafale from France. So therefore, we are squeezed because we are not self-sufficient in high-tech armament. We depend on the West as well as on the Russians. So which side to take has become a critical problem. We are not able to take sides. We are playing it neutral. We are not criticizing Russia. We are not siding with the US completely. We are seen in the UN and other agencies that we have played the middle ground. But that would mean that, the trust in India would decrease. Like, for instance, we are part of the Quad, which is to encircle China. Now that the US will see us as not a very reliable partner. On the other hand, China will pressurize Russia to reduce the flow of armament and supplies to India. So India could be in a very difficult position. But our advantage at the moment is that Russia, having been sanctioned, is willing to supply inputs very cheap. So for instance, it's supplying petroleum, the crude oil, at $25 below the pre-war price, which is a great concession. So suddenly India is importing a lot of oil from Russia, similarly coal from there, and Russia would be willing to trade at much lower prices, but that would mean that the West would look upon it as not siding with them. And China would always put pressure on Russia to not give us more and more of armament and so on, to keep us weak. So we are in a very difficult situation, who to go with, because we cannot completely cut off with Russia. We cannot completely cut off with the US. So we'll try and stay somewhere in between, try and play it as much. But that would only mean that neither side would really trust us. And therefore, our flow of technology, our flow of military equipment, etc., could slow down. Our position in the Quad and with the US could weaken. So, these are the kind of difficulties that we'll have. On the trade front, we may be sanctioned, some of the banks which are going to be used to pay, because Russia has a very positive trade balance with India because of the supplies that it gives us. And if we buy more and more of petroleum goods from there, then more and more surplus will be there. Just like China has a huge surplus with India. So that would create a problem, how to make the payments. So we may have to use those banks which don't have much trade relationship with, say, the Western powers. So that even if they're sanctioned, that will only be because they're trade making payments to the Russians. So RBI and the Russian bank will have to make some arrangements as to how the financial dealings would take place between India and Russia. Having said that, India would have to worry about our borders. Our defense expenditure could go up if China puts more pressure, seeing that India has been weakened. And that would mean less expenditure on development, less expenditure within the country on taking care of the poor. The budget could be in a bit of a crisis. the budgetary crisis would also arise, because if our economy slows down, then our revenue collection will slow down. So in real terms, the revenue collection may come down, even though in monetary terms, because of inflation, they'll go up. Okay. But in real terms, the revenue may come down, whereas expenditures may have to be increased, because all projects, etc., that are there, capital item, they will increase in prices, and our support to the poor, which is required because if inflation is there and economy is slowing down, then more support may be needed for the poor. So subsidies to the poor in terms of food and so on. Fertilizer prices have gone up, so fertilizer subsidies will go up. So expenditures will rise, whereas revenues will be short, and therefore our deficit would increase. Now, in that situation, how much would we be able to spend on our defense? Because the pressure from China could increase, sensing the situation.
Thank you, sir. Just one question. You talked about how our growth is falling, and other pressures too on the budget. Given that, and you also talked about consumer sentiment, given all these things, can we still do something to simulate demand and try to raise consumer sentiment? Do we have enough policy options? Do we have enough leeway to do something to sort of kickstart the economy? Can we do that?
So our growth rate was falling even before the pandemic. Over 8 quarters, our quarterly growth rate had fallen from 8% to 3.1%, which was because demand was short. And why was the demand short? Because inequalities were increasing in the economy, and the unorganized sector was getting hurt very badly. Now, those factors remain, because as you notice in the pandemic period, the rich have become very rich, billionaires' numbers have increased, and so on. And as the price survey showed, which came out at the end of January of this year, that the top 20% gained incomes, while the bottom 60% lost incomes. So inequality has clearly increased as a result of the pandemic and demonetization and the hurt of the unorganized sector. Now, those factors remain. That's why my argument is that in our GDP data, we do not count the unorganized sector independently. We simply assume that the unorganized sector is growing at the same rate as the organized sector. Now, that is demonetization, but it's certainly not true after demonetization, since when the unorganized sector has been declining. It has been hit by demonetization, by GST, which is not the right thing for it, hit by the NBFC crisis, and then the pandemic. So within 5 years, it had 4 big shocks. So if you incorporate the unorganized sector, then our growth rate is not 8%, but it's already close to 0, which means we are already have been in recession or close to recession. So the Indian economy is hurting very badly, and people are very disturbed. Unemployment situation is very high, especially the youth unemployment, especially within the more educated you are, the more the unemployment, as the periodic labor force data suggests. So this unemployment situation, loss of incomes, etc., that means the consumer sentiment will not revive unless we begin to give more in the hands of the poor people, the unorganized sector, and so on. And we try to revive the micro sector. The micro sector, which is the largest part of the unorganized non-agriculture sector, that has been declining. That requires support from the government. But unfortunately, what the government has done is it has lumped together the MSME. There's a micro, small, and medium. So any policies it announces, the benefit goes to small and medium, but the micro doesn't get the benefit. So micro units are 6 crore units. Small and medium are only 6 lakh units. So 99% of MSME is micro, and the micro sector employs 97.5% of the MSME. Now that 97.5% has been declining. And that's why our, if you look at the labor force participation rate, it has, according to CMI, dropped from 46% in 2015-16 to 40%. And even our 46% was very low compared to other comparable countries like China and Brazil, where it's about 60%. So roughly 20% of our people in the age group of 15 to 64, they are not in the labor force. And therefore, their contribution to GDP is very low. And all these people are the unorganized sector people. And that's why I'm saying that the unorganized sector has been declining, because this number, which has been decreasing, okay, that is from the unorganized sector. And that's why the unorganized sector is declining. but we proxy in our GDP by saying the unorganized sector is growing at the same rate as the organized sector, which is not true. So that's why the problem is that the demand cannot come up unless the government changes its stance. Government stance is that we'll do supply side economics. Supply side economics means we'll give concessions to businesses and they will invest more and therefore the economy will grow. Now, when demand is short, then businesses will not invest more. And even the organized sector data, which is what RBI puts out, called capacity utilization data, that shows that it has been hovering around 70% for the last many years. And it had dropped very sharply during the pandemic. Even now, it's back to about 72% only. Now, with that low capacity utilization, investment will not rise. And that's why investment had peaked in 2012-13 at about 36% and then dropped to 30%. So if investment drops, then the rate of growth will not pick up. Employment generation will not pick up. So government needs to change policy and now give money in the hand of the unorganized sector, the unemployed, revive the micro sector. Then what will happen is many supply bottlenecks that came up because of business closures, that will go. Demand will increase. So rural employment guarantee scheme should be increased. Urban employment guarantee scheme should be started, so that a lot of young people who don't have jobs, they'll begin to have some work. And you can create employment, mass employment in the field of education, in the field of health, rural drinking water, and other such decentralized projects. What the government has done is it is investing money in centralized big projects, like the freight corridor, the national highways, etc., 4-lane, 6-lane, 8-lane highways. Now, these are highly automated now. Earlier, I remember in the 70s and 80s, in these big projects, you see hundreds of people working, Now you see 5 or 10 people working with big bulldozers, with big cranes, etc. So direct employment generation in these capital-intensive projects is very low, unlike earlier. So that's why I'm saying we shouldn't go for these highly capital-intensive projects. We should go for decentralized projects in the rural areas, in urban areas, because a lot of infrastructure is very inadequate in the rural areas and very poor quality in urban areas. You can see the infrastructure in the slums hardly exists. Government schools have very poor quality of education. As the ACER report suggests, 50% children in the rural schools in the 5th class cannot do second class reading, second class writing, second class mathematics, so they will drop out. They'll remain poor for the next 50 years. So in other words, there's a lot of things that the government can do to revive demand from below, rather than give concessions to the corporate sector and give concessions to businesses, etc., which is not going to work because the demand is short. So we have seen the example of that in 2019, when the corporate tax rate was sharply cut, it was expected that now more investment will take place. But instead of investment, what they did was they simply got rid of their debt. So now many of these companies are debt-free, but they haven't increased capital investment. So yes, capital investment will increase in some areas, like for instance in telecom and IT sector where there's a boom, but not in the economy as a whole. Okay. Whereas we need to enhance investment in the economy as a whole, including the small, medium, and the micro sector. The micro sector is crucial. That's where the demand would generate. Now, the government, instead of doing that, it's simply going for supply side economics, which is not going to deliver when demand is short.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for explaining such complex issues. We hope it was, I'm sure it was very educative and enlightening for our readers too. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.